Hello and welcome to episode 22 at the House of Dissent podcast. In this episode, I'll be reading from chapter 10 of the book titled The Internet and Radical Voices of Dissent that I published in March 2025. And this chapter is titled Burmese Guerrilla Warfare, Technology and Identity, and it's written by Maranjayi Ma. To understand the possibilities and challenges for the oppositional forces to defeat the military dictatorship in Burma and create a viable unified system, we need to understand the obstacles that rebel forces are confronted with. There is an irony in Burmese politics, perhaps, found nowhere else given its size, which is this. It is relatively easy for the military dictatorship to maintain control through coercive tactics over a country which has such diverse ethnic, cultural and political differences despite their collective abhorrence to the junta. Burma is a geographical patchwork of ethnic diversity, and thus far history has shown that disunity of oppositional rebel forces is the only friend of the dictatorship, which allows it to hold a centralized position over society. The junta, ironically and cynically, produces propaganda based on unity, peace, certainty, arguing further that the rebels are so fractured, disunified, and infected by diverse ethnic, cultural, and political differences, making governing by them obsolete. The questions I must pose, therefore, is this. Is there a possibility in modern times that ethnic differences can be set aside to confront the centralized power of the military? And if so, what is the means for achieving it? When I was invited to contribute a chapter towards this book, I immediately felt that the time was right for a discussion on resistance in Burma because now, unlike any time in our past, the Internet offers possibilities for emancipation, freedom and solutions for a unified opposition. I asked myself, can the Internet and social media platforms play a similar role in Burma to create a national sense of identity that may bring previously disparate groups together in the same way as the railway networks did in 19th century Great Britain, along with telegraph cables, radio, television and film? Mass communications is the means for enabling a sense of national identity, and this process began with the invention of the Gutenberg press in Germany. In the UK, mass communications also enabled more cultural meaning within the Union Jack to unite the three countries of England, Scotland and Wales and the region of Northern Ireland. And the establishment of the BBC further cemented a British national identity. This framework has been lacking in Burma. Plus, the situation is extremely more complex than the UK, because Burma, in relation to its size, has one of the most diverse ethnic groupings found anywhere in the world. To get a scale of the size of my country, it is almost 2.8 times larger than the United Kingdom, or 178% bigger in landmass. The population, however, is greater in the UK, with nearly 10 million more at around 67.8 million. And yet there are a staggering 135 different ethnic groups in Burma, coalescing under 8 major racial groups. The largest racial group in Burma is the Burma, and it is estimated that the Burma constitute between 67 to 69% of the population. So the Burma dominate the landscape in numbers, but also crucially in both religious and political spheres. The Burma are Buddhists, and Buddhism is the national religion of Burma, and they form the dictatorship. The remaining 7 racial groups are the Kachin, Shan, Chin, Kaya, Karen, Mon, and the Rakhine. The Chin has the largest number of ethnic groups, 53, and is overwhelmingly Christian, with a smaller number of Buddhists, and they are the most persecuted of all the ethnic people in Burma. The other group with an overwhelming Christian heritage is the Kachin people. Interestingly, it wasn't the British who were the colonial power in Burma that converted the Kachin from animism to Christianity, but rather it was the American missionaries. The Burma has a small number of ethnic groups, 9 in total, but as I explained above, the Burma has the largest population in Burma, with around 35 million people. Now that you understand the complex character of the people of Burma, it will also help you to further grasp this complexity by knowing how the British contributed towards the diverse ethnic character of my country. British rule began 200 years ago in 1824, ending in 1948, around the same time frame as the British retreated from India and Palestine, and like those countries, they left the people of Burma in the inevitable post-colonial era of violence. I was born in 1950, 2 years after British rule ended, and like many young people had little knowledge of the colonial past in any detail, other than the British came from a faraway land. First they seized Assam in 1824, which led to further incursions into Burma and the beginning of British rule. The British were delighted to have conquered Burma because now they controlled the trade supply routes through to China. When I was 14, my mother gave me a book to read to help me understand the British colonial mentality. It was Burmese Days by George Orwell. The main protagonist is John Flory, a timber merchant who yearned to be married, not to a Burmese woman, oh no, not a native, but to a white English lady of fine standing. The British purposely sowed division, and the writer Maitri Aung Fan details how, before the British ruled Burma, ethnic groups intermingled and traded with each other in quite a harmonious fashion. It was the British that fomented ethnic differences for their own purpose. They call this divide and rule. And they favoured one group, which were the Kachin, and they marginalised another group, the Burma. As I explained above, the Burma are the largest group, so trouble after the British left was always going to happen. I am a Kachin, and it was for this reason my parents left Burma. Before the British left, they committed to the Panglong Agreement in 1947, which had the support of various racial groups. I have carefully read the Panglong Agreement, which has been greatly misinterpreted. Many Burmese people believed it was an agreement to award geographical areas of Burma based on ethnic differences, but this wasn't so. The Panglong Agreement was a document signed to award administrative control of locations. The lesson to be learned is that the agreement was committed to creating a democratic federal state, and this must be the aim for different ethnic rebel groups waging guerrilla war against the military dictatorship in the present day. This is the unifying goal. The 1947 Panglong Agreement is a worthwhile blueprint to observe, return to and revise according to the current context of Burma. This is how identity can be formulated on what I call united differences of federalism, based on respect for each other, but crucially on centralized democratic accountability and ethnic representation. The only Burma person to sign the Panglong Agreement was Aung San, who supported ethnic autonomy. But Aung San was subsequently assassinated, causing a deep suspicion, particularly against the Kachin, who many thought were behind it. But no evidence exists. It was my people, the Kachin, who live in the northwest of Burma, on the border with China, who were to gain a lot from the agreement because it stipulated the creation of the Kachin state, so it made no sense for the Kachin to kill Aung San because it would have been counterproductive. Since then, evidence has emerged that British soldiers stationed in Burma had sold their weaponry, which found their way into the hands of unknown renegades. There is one fact that cannot be denied, which is the bullets were fired from British weapons. Who killed Aung San? Perhaps we'll never know, but his strident anti-British colonial beliefs, coupled with the fact that he was a member of the Burmese Communist Party and later the Socialist Party, had made Aung San many enemies. Added to that was also the fact that Aung San was supported by the Japanese to oust the British from Burma. In sum, the British had the motives for his removal. Despite this tragedy, if the current military dictatorship, known otherwise as the Tatmadaw, can be decisively defeated by oppositional forces in the future, we must not focus on Aung San's assassination, but rather reconfigure the Panglong Agreement to the 21st century to ensure unity. Let's call the new document Panglong 2.0. In 1982, whilst I was living in London, I came across an idiom which is, "Be careful what you wish for," during a discussion on socialism with friends. The author of this saying is the Greek fabulist Aesop, a slave in ancient Greece. Perhaps the former Prime Minister of Burma, U Nu, should have learned from Aesop when U Nu allowed the military commander, Ne Win, to take power as the interim Prime Minister in 1958. U Nu insisted on the takeover being a short-term remedy for the disorder that had plagued Burma and was indeed handed back power in 1960. But then in 1962, Ne Win staged his coup d'etat, remaining in power until 1988. In 1962 there existed the Burmese state, but without a Burmese national identity, so the military decided to create one through force, and thus began the dictatorship of false identity in my country. Between 1960 and 1962, U Nu had attempted to form a united Buddhist identity, which would exclude other religious beliefs. It's not entirely clear what U Nu is trying to establish overall by this move. Or was he of the belief that Christians, for example, would simply convert to Buddhism to forge a new religious national identity? Ne Win, who was of Chinese descent, repealed many of U Nu's policies, knowing that ethnic groups who were predominantly Christian, such as the Kachin and the Karen, would become marginalized. So it's not at this point in history that Buddhism becomes the hegemonic religion in Burma. Instead, it is the new political, not theological philosophy that gains track under the leadership of Ne Win post-1962. The military dictatorship instigated socialism as the prevailing ideology of Burmese life, and like Cuba, for example, socialism became so ingrained it coalesced into a national identity that incorporated political, economic, social and cultural spheres of Burma. In other words, it was an attempt at a total capture of identity. Should U Nu have been more careful for what he had wished for? In hindsight, when we carefully observe and calculate the period of Ne Win's rule, there is no doubt in my mind that it is far more nuanced than people might believe. For instance, in 1964, he created the Burmese Socialist Program Party, the BSPP, and began defining the Burmese character of socialism. There were many projects initiated during this period that I can only admire, such as free healthcare, public education programs through a mass approach to eradicating illiteracy. The party also addressed the issue of land ownership, which sought to abolish rent so the poor rural people could produce food and live a decent life in the countryside, free from exploitation. But it failed, and Ne Win was sent packing in 1988 when the students rebelled against the catastrophic failures of the one-party state. What is known as the 8888 uprising was a nationwide insurrection that would eventually include many other people to rebel, such as workers and professionals, and it became a defining moment in Burmese history. But I wanted to also tell you about a very special Burmese tradition, which perhaps ironically has been deeply embedded in our lives that it can be seen as a part of our identity. This is student demonstrations and dissent. This is the first time I have used the word dissent in a book that is about dissent, rebellion, uprisings and insurrections. But you readers should be patient and learn more about our history slowly. Not everything can be learned via TikTok in an instant. The fundamental flaw in any dictatorship is that they govern by coercion, not by consent, and the reason that the military's attempt to create a unified Burmese identity through force was always doomed to fail. Coercion may be an effective weapon to beat the Burmese population with and try to subdue them through terror tactics, but as a policy it is stupidity of the highest order. They don't need to think too hard about coercive tactics, which is one reason that the most dictatorships are governed by uneducated and largely ignorant people. On the other hand, the means to achieving consent of the people to govern is based on mental exercise, rational thinking, philosophy, and exposing yourself to deselection in a democratic process. All far too onerous and much too complex to comprehend for dictatorships. As Antonio Gramsci argued, gaining the consent of the people through a process called hegemony demands a strong sense of self-belief, confidence, and the trust of the independent judgments of citizens, which is far too risky for corrupt bureaucratic dictatorships to be involved with. Dictatorial coercion is the negation of a unified national identity, and one clear example of this was during the 1980s when the Burmese military dictatorship introduced the citizen law that deliberately sought to exclude the Rohingya people from national identity. The Rohingya were and remain an easy target because they are Muslim, and like all fascist dictatorships, and I do not use the word fascist lightly, the Burmese form required a scapegoat to merely survive. They enjoy creating enemies from within because they seek to ensure a continual crisis of which they can only manage. When the so-called enemy within is revealed, more oppressive policies are equally revealed to combat them. Every form of fascism purposely creates enemies because it has no other way of surviving, and so they define themselves accordingly as saviours of the people. In Italy, fascists obsessed and propagandized over socialists. In Germany, the Nazis focused on Jews, Roma, communists and more. In Greece, Spain and Portugal, socialists were also the main threat. The American imperialists backed fascist dictatorships in Chile, Brazil, Argentina, Nicaragua, El Salvador, etc., who delighted in their hatred of socialists, of which many thousands were killed. Homosexuals are always a target. Feminists who question the authority of a cult of male personality are in the firing line. And of course, fascists in Latin America have relied heavily upon the Catholic Church for support of their warped views of family. Some Catholic Jesuits bucked that trend, such as those who helped form the National Liberation Army in Colombia, whose brand of liberation theology saw no quantifying difference or contradiction between the Bible scriptures and the revolutionary words of Karl Marx in Das Kapital. So, why am I telling this story about fascism and coercion? Well, because when oppositional forces in Burma defeat the military dictatorship, as they inevitably will, they must learn from fascist history, and moreover they must read, engage, and learn from Antonio Gramsci, because his theory of hegemony and consent is about making the Burmese in the same way it was meant to make the Italians. But readers, there is one more lesson to learn from Gramsci, which for Burma is so important, and that is the military state apparatus under which people live must be dismantled to create a healthy civil service where we, the people of Burma, can exist with relative freedoms. Countries that have sizable civil societies are the most democratic, whilst countries that have overbearing and bureaucratically bloated state systems that limit the size of a civil society are the least democratic. There are so many examples in history where the state sector was all dominant, only to be turned into systems where civil society dominates. But for the sake of expediency, I will give you two examples, which are Albania and Romania. Other countries in the former Soviet Union had similar systems, but only Albania and Romania were truly totalitarian states. Hungary was less so. Everything was controlled by the state in Albania and Romania. Nobody dared even to speak critically and publicly at a cafe in fear of being reported to the state police. Informers were everywhere. But look at those two countries today, since their repressive regimes were overthrown. Both have burgeoning civil societies, and although problems remain in both systems, it is worth remembering that history moves awfully slowly. Besides, neither older capitalist systems such as the UK or the USA can boast progress with their respective discrepancies in wealth between classes and huge numbers of people living in poverty. Hope comes, goes, and comes again in Burma. In 2015, it looked as if progress was at last bearing down upon my country when a nationwide ceasefire agreement was signed, but sadly some groups refused to sign it. This wasn't even 2 steps forward, 1 step backwards. It was the continuation of a fragmented and disunited country. In the 2015 election, the National League for Democracy, NLD, came to power with General Aung San's daughter taking the leading role as General Secretary of the party. Aung San Suu Kyi, who had been under house arrest for 15 years, now looked as if, with Western support, she would take Burma into the new era of democratic reform. But true to form, the military launched another coup, and Aung San Suu Kyi was immediately arrested. The date of the coup was February the 1st, 2020, the same date as the February the 1st, 1958 coup. The 2021 coup triggered an unprecedented alliance amongst different ethnic resistance groups in Burma, and there is no doubt in my mind that this would never have happened without the use of modern-day technology that has brought these groups together. New technology is both revolutionizing communication between ethnic groups and changing the character of the guerrilla warfare. This moment in history should not be underestimated, because Burma is a large country covered in thick, dense forests and mountain ranges that are extremely difficult and dangerous to traverse. For the first time since 2021, the junta looked vulnerable to defeat. And the one weapon the regime used to counter advances made by oppositional forces is the internet, used as a weapon of war, terror and fear. It may be an old cliché that the internet is a battleground for opposing groups to gain advantage in terms of persuasion, but in Burma, this is relatively new. One example of the junta's recent use of social media to gain advantage was reported by the Irrawaddy's February the 7th, 2024 article, when a video of 2 dead resistance fighters from the Yao Defense Force, the YDF, was uploaded to the internet. The YDF identified the guerrilla fighters who were tortured and hung from a tree facing downwards with their hands and legs tied to an iron chain. Then a fire was lit beneath them, and slowly the fire with plumes of smoke burned the 2 fighters alive. This brutal war crime was conducted in the YDF-controlled village called Myaokinyan, and villagers were made to watch the men burned to death as a warning not to join or protect YDF guerrilla fighters. Uploading the video to the internet is a deliberate attempt to maximize fear amongst and beyond the village of Myaokinyan. This is one side of how technology has transformed warfare in Burma. The video is accompanied by the murderers laughing throughout, and at the end of the video the camera switches from the two dead men hanging burnt above the fire towards a group of militiamen clasping their mobile phones, uploading the scene live and celebrating. So readers, you should know about the militia group called the Pyu Sao Ti and their relationship with the military dictatorship, not only because the Pyu Sao Ti were there at the village organising the war crime, but also because of their wider role in the conflict. The pro-democracy progressive voice says the Pyu Sao Ti are plainclothes and have used their anonymity to terrorise civilians and ambush local PDF with the support of the junta group troops. The PDF are the People's Defence Force. I will tell you about this group a little later, but for now here is more on the brutal militia force from Progressive Voice. Pyu Sao Ti comprises of military veterans, they say, and Buddhist ultra-nationalist pro-military supporters, with its roots in Marbate, an organisation of ultra-nationalist Buddhists whom the military bred and nurtured, both financially and politically as part of the control machine and to garner legitimacy. Marbate is notorious for propagating hate against ethnic and religious communities that are not part of the Burma Buddhist hegemony. The junta set up the secretive Pyu Sao Ti to combat the PDF, and because they dress in plain clothes, they mimic PDF fighters, infiltrate, then kill. The National Unity Government, NUJ, Burma, has estimated that the number of atrocities the regime has committed since the 2021 coup is 144, with close to 2,000 people massacred in the process. The main reason the Pyu Sao Ti are so brutal and barbaric is because the group is mostly made up of retired and former junta fighters, and they are well versed in cruelty beyond imagination. But dear reader, forces of resistance are not cowed by these bullies and murderers, for they commit their heinous crimes only out of fear and insecurity, and in that act of cowardice they reveal their inevitable fallibility. Ultranationalist Buddhists that support the junta are central to the organisation of the Pyu Sao Ti. The ultranationalist Buddhist group Marbate evolved from the anti-Muslim nationalist organisation known as the 969 movement. The Marbate altered their name to the Buddha Dhamma Panita Foundation, but this is merely a sleight of hand to detract from Marbate's history. The junta finances them, and in this sense the monks are paramilitaries who enforce brutal methods against all opposition, not only Muslims. The monks believe that the greatest threat to their religion is Islam, but it's not the only threat they claim. Whilst they believe Islam could conquer Burma as it did in North Africa, the Levant and Persia, they also fear the slow road to Buddhist disintegration by forces of global Western modernity, because that would unlock a different way of thinking or a new rationality that would question the authority of the monks. The belief in being subsumed within Western modernity and the ideology that entails isn't new. We can trace this fear of the other to the days of British colonialism. The community of Buddhists that followed the teachings of Buddha is referred to as the Sangha. And Buddhists during the colonial period believed that British ways of living and the secularization of education would threaten the philosophical teachings and practices of the Buddha, called shasana, a word that replaces the dogmatic term religion, because in Buddhism there is no divine being. In Burma, almost 90% of the population are Buddhist, and like Catholicism, during the period of the Protestant Reformation in 17th century Europe, the monks fear their control over the people of Burma will slowly diminish over time, unless they act. In 2021, the Tatmadaw, the dictatorship, created the Union Solidarity and Development Party, which is the junta's proxy political party. In the same year, the National Unity Government, NUJ, was formed in exile and in opposition to the dictatorship. From within the NUG is the People's Defence Force, PDF, who were formed to combat the regime, and as I told you, the junta formed the paramilitary group PUSOT to combat the PDF. Aung San Suu Kyi is listed on the NUG's website as state councillor. We call Aung San Suu Kyi Daw Suu, out of respect for her heroism. This means Mother Suu. Daw Suu was arrested on February 1st, 2021, the day of the coup, and she remains in prison today. The junta has given Daw Suu a 27-year sentence, and remember, readers, Daw Suu spent 15 years previously under house arrest. What words would you use to describe this form of punishment? U Win Mint is the president of NUG, and he too is in prison. But the rest of the officials involved in NUG remain in hiding in Burma as a resistance group that coordinates the actions of the People's Defence Force. The point I wish to raise and focus on is NUG's website, which is helping to transform how dissenting voices are organised. This may not seem that unusual in Western countries, but in countries such as Burma, with huge tracts of forest cover, mountains and poor communicative networks, their website acts as a focal point for all guerrilla groups. Whilst NUG is careful with its language, there is no doubt in my mind that their website is not just a reminder to the people of Burma that they exist, important as this is, but also it is designed to alter the character of guerrilla tactics and warfare by messaging unity. We can see the role of the NUG wants to play in the process of unifying all oppositional forces by its messaging on its website. For example, there are 2 points I will highlight under the headline Duties and Mandates of Interim National Unity Government. The first is this: the Interim National Unity Government shall create a space where partner political parties, ethnic armed revolutionary organisations and civil society organisations can work together to discuss and validate political agreements and implement the way forward. And the other is this: the Interim National Unity Government shall adopt a strategy for the eradication of the dictatorship, abolishment of the 2008 Constitution, and building a federal democracy union, and implement the strategy. In both these statements, we can witness the utilisation and implementation of the internet, social media and other communicative networks as a weapon to unite opposing groups and to plead to the ethnic guerrilla organisation to change their respective guerrilla tactics to achieve the overthrow of the junta. NUG's X account is alive with comments on resisting the military dictatorship, found at hashtag What's Happening in Burma. An example is on the Call to Arms, posted February 13th, 2024, which said, Statement on the Conscription Law. We urge the brave people of Burma to intensify their participation in the Spring Revolution and call on our courageous revolutionary forces to strengthen cooperation among us. Added to the X account, there is also Radio NUG, daily program and an internet podcast which can be found on their Facebook page. This clearly demonstrates that NUG have compiled a complete and powerful communicative network to fight the regime with, and the junta's need to forcibly increase conscription in Burma is a sure sign that they are losing many battles and soldiers. But they are also using similar technological tools of resistance that dissenting voices use so effectively. The human rights group Access Now have detailed how the dictatorship is resorting to using social media to place fear into the population. The use of social media by the junta isn't new because they have used Facebook before Meta removed them. But they turned to Telegram to expose social media users critical of the regime by publishing their private information. This technique is called doxing in social media circles. And as recently as July 2023, the BBC Newsnight programme sourced Burma Witness on X to inform Telegram of the junta's abuse of their platform. Telegram informed the BBC that whilst they defend free speech, they said, however, sharing private information, doxing and calling for violence are explicitly forbidden. Not all the accounts were removed, and this is an example of how the internet and social media has become a double-edged sword, a weapon of resistance and of state surveillance in the fight for democracy over tyranny. The regime's channel on Telegram at the time of writing is Kakahan, and it is full of vitriol against anyone that dares to dissent against the regime. What this reveals is that the regime has learnt not to publish private information of certain individuals other than their name, but they still become a target for oppression. Out of the abyss of state-led barbarity is a success story that I need to tell you about, dear readers. This is important because NUG and all dissenting oppositional voices require your attention and, where possible, your support. Remember how I told you at the beginning of this chapter how many different ethnic groups there are in my country and how differences and disagreements have historically obstructed the unity that today the NUG is calling for to successfully defeat the hated military regime. Firstly, let me tell you about ethnic armed organizations who were gathered under United Nationalities Federal Council until 4 ethnic groups left due to the lack of trust in the council. The council has subsequently been replaced by the Federal Political Negotiation and Consultative Committee, the FPNCC. Now, let me tell you about the Northern Alliance, which was formed in 2016, consisting of 4 ethnic groups, which are the Kachin Independence Army, the KIA, the Burma National Democratic Alliance Army, the MNDAA, the Tang National Liberation Front, TNLA, and the Arakan Army, which is AA. The Kachin Independence Army is the armed wing of the Kachin Independence Organization, known as KIO, and both were established in 1961, making KIA, the Kachin Independence Army, the oldest resistance group of the 4. The Northern Alliance had an internet and social media presence up to 2019 when Facebook banned the organisation. In the same year, 3 ethnic guerrilla groups affiliated to the Northern Alliance, and they formed the 3 Brotherhood Alliance, also known as the 3BHA, and decided to fight in tandem with the NUG's PDF guerrilla fighters. To highlight the vital role the internet and social media is playing in the growing collective struggle against the regime, a report in Al Jazeera on January the 16th, 2024, said the coalition's recent gains and its social media presence could be denting the military's reputation. Technology has always played a part in modern warfare, but historically this has mainly benefited imperialist states such as the USA and Vietnam, with the Viets having to use traditional guerrilla warfare to combat the Americans' technological advantage. In Burma today, however, after years of similar guerrilla tactics to the Viets, ambush, etc., the internet and social media has opened up a new technological and informational front, which is radically altering guerrilla warfare. This allows the guerrillas to combat propaganda tactics over time and space, which has been the preserve of the state. The 3PHA have been quick to use social media, and on their Facebook page, and dated January 29, 2024, the organisation posted this note, saying, "War news on Operation 1027. Release time at 12 p.m. on January 27, 2024. And it said, "Our military targets and determination have not deviated since the initiation of Operation 1027 on October 27 up to today, January 27, 2024. The Three Brotherhood Alliance earnestly declares that we stand unwaveringly with the people of Burma in their pursuit of eradicating the military dictatorship. We will provide ongoing real-time updates on battle reports." In Hindi, such an alliance is described as Nahe Charega I Dosti, meaning this friendship will not leave. So now, dear reader, you need to know who the MNDAA plus TNLA plus AA are in this story of guerrilla warfare and technological advancement. The first guerrilla group, the MNDAA, are the Burma National Democratic Alliance. They exist in the Kokand region in the northeast of the Shan state and have their ethnic roots in Han Chinese. They regained control of the capital, Kokand, in the Laokai area from the dictatorship on December 26, 2023. The internet media site used by MNDAA is Kokand Media. The second group, the TNLA, are the Tang National Liberation Army, and they are the armed wing of the political party, the Panglong State Liberation Front. They are in the Panglong zone, in the northwest of the Shan state. The third group, the AA, are the Arakan Army, which are located in the Rakhine state on the far west of Burma, and they are the armed wing of the political party, the United League of Arakan. They also have a military presence in Chin, Shan, and even the far northern state of Kachin, where they were originally formed. The Arakan's army Facebook account contains numerous videos documenting the conflict with the military dictatorship and how the Muslim Rohingya are caught in the crossfire of the conflict on the Bangladeshi border. The Irrawaddy paper has a Facebook page at War Against the Junta Myanmar, where it publishes interesting content on the collective armed struggle against the junta. For example, there's a video footage of the KIA and PDF forces and AA capturing strategic points from the junta. And there's also drone footage of missile hits on the military dictatorship. Drone technology is radically transforming guerrilla warfare because it enables smaller hit-and-run units. When the footage is uploaded on the internet, this in turn inspires the guerrillas and demoralizes the dictatorship forces. It is worth noting that, unlike the Turkish forces who are fighting the Kurdish PKK, the junta in Burma lacks sophisticated surveillance methods, which allows the rebels to be far more open and audacious in their new guerrilla tactics. Guerrilla warfare in Burma is changing at such a rapid pace due to new technological developments in both military hardware and the means of communicating across time and space. When I reflect upon the tactics guerrillas organizations have used in the past, such as the Viet Minh, the Viet Cong, Chinese Communists, and the 26th July movement in Cuba to combat their enemy, in the context specific to them, it is obvious for survival reasons that the tactics they used routinely changed as the action was unfolding. For instance, when Mao wrote his pamphlet titled On Guerrilla Warfare in 1937, it began with this question: what is guerrilla warfare? And Mao said, the essence of guerrilla warfare is revolutionary in character, because it shares the same political aspirations of the Chinese people. But Mao crucially recognized through experience that guerrilla tactics changed and adapted to the changing circumstances of war. Surely that same logic applies to Burma today. And whilst new technology, the use of the internet and social media doesn't guarantee victory for the rebel forces, it does, however, cement itself as the means that has changed guerrilla warfare for good. I'm not arguing that so-called traditional types of warfare are outdated. Quite the contrary, such older, more basic methods are juxtaposed with technology that makes guerrilla warfare such a potent force of resistance. But the caveat that we must have in Burma is technology is only useful and productive if the multitude of guerrilla organizations and NUG manage to support federal governing system when victory comes, as it surely will. So, who am I in this story of resistance? I am Maran Jayima from the Kachin people of Burma, and I currently live in exile in the United Kingdom, and I refer only to my country as Burma. I fled my country 2 days after the coup in 2021, knowing that the pen is indeed mightier than the sword, which is why the junta fears writing so much. All dictatorships fear this. And now resistance groups have successfully managed to embrace and use the internet effectively. This fear has grown exponentially. In Burma, this technological development has taken on a new critical dimension, because this technology is in the hands of armed rebel groups, which is changing guerrilla warfare as I type. But in the end, when the junta are destroyed, there is only one form of liberation possible for a country with such diversity, and this is what I call unity of federalism. This is the final reading from the Internet and Radical Voices of Dissent book. I hope you have enjoyed them, and if you have enjoyed them, there are other chapters in the book not presented for this podcast. Please click likes, leave a comment, or even click follow. Thanks for listening, and bye for now.